This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Ibrahim Al-Farouk arrived in the small town of Arcadia, Oklahoma, on a hot summer morning, the sun burning the earth beneath his feet. His journey had been long, spanning across states and borders, tracing his spiritual quest for inner peace. Dressed in simple monk's robes that clung to his thin frame, he cut an odd figure against the backdrop of the rural American landscape. He had chosen this place for its isolation, its quiet simplicity. Arcadia was a town of just a few thousand people where the slow rhythm of life lulled its residents into a false sense of security. It was here, amidst the cornfields and modest wooden homes, that Ibrahim hoped to settle into his final chapter. The gentle hum of daily life seemed like the perfect balm for his restless soul. Having spent years wandering through distant lands, studying various schools of thought, religions, and philosophies, Ibrahim believed he had found his place in the world. He had once been a part of a community of Islamic scholars, but their rigid doctrines had failed to provide him with the peace he so desperately sought. He turned to the monastic lifestyle, withdrawing from the chaos of modernity, choosing silence and meditation as his guiding forces. Ibrahim sought a higher truth, one that transcended religious boundaries and led him to a purer existence. He had walked many paths, studied many doctrines, but his search was far from over. In the heart of Arcadia, he thought, he would find the stillness that would finally allow him to reach enlightenment. The small, modest monastery he chose to call home had once been a place of quiet reflection, though it had long since fallen into disrepair. Its walls were cracked, the stained glass windows shattered from years of neglect. It sat on the outskirts of town, just beyond the tree line, where the sprawling fields of corn met the wild, untamed forest. The monks who had once tended to the place had moved on, their numbers dwindling to none, leaving only the fading relics of their faith behind. For Ibrahim, the brokenness of the building reflected his own fractured mind. It was in this state of ruin that he sought to rebuild, to reclaim a semblance of peace. The townspeople had been skeptical at first. They were used to the familiar faces, the everyday workers and farmers who populated their tight-knit community. Ibrahim's arrival with his foreign ways and distant air was unsettling. His quiet mannerisms, his refusal to engage in the usual small talk, his downcast eyes, his reclusive behavior, only deepened their suspicion. At first, they had dismissed him as just another eccentric wanderer, a man on a spiritual journey who would soon move on to the next place. But weeks turned into months, and Ibrahim did not leave. He became a fixture of the town's landscape, walking into the local market every few days, purchasing only the bare necessities: bread, water, fruit. He never spoke much, keeping to himself and rarely making eye contact with others, but his presence was undeniable, like a shadow hanging over the town, watching and waiting. Ibrahim had a peculiar routine. He would rise before the sun each day and spend hours in meditation and prayer, either in the decaying chapel or alone beneath the towering oak trees that dotted the monastery grounds. His deep connection to the earth, to the silence of the world around him, was evident in the stillness he maintained. There was something unnerving about him, though. Something hidden beneath the surface. His eyes, dark and hollow, were always searching, always looking, as if he were on the verge of uncovering some great truth that others could not see. And yet, despite the intensity of his gaze, there was also an emptiness in them, a void, a sense that he was searching for something not in the world, but within himself. Over time, the people of Arcadia grew used to Ibrahim's presence. He was a curiosity, a figure that drifted through the town without ever truly belonging. But for the most part, the townsfolk left him alone. He never caused trouble, never made demands. He was simply there, and that was enough for them. The local imam, an older man named Hassan, was one of the few who made an effort to reach out to Ibrahim. Hassan was a kind soul, eager to welcome anyone seeking knowledge, regardless of their faith or background. But Ibrahim was elusive, never staying long enough to engage in a meaningful conversation. Their interactions were brief, fleeting, a few words of courtesy, a nod of the head, a passing smile, but nothing more. Ibrahim was like a ghost, a figure that seemed to drift in and out of existence. Despite the isolation, there were moments when Ibrahim seemed to connect with the land. On long walks through the cornfields or in the dense forests surrounding the monastery, he would pause and stand still for hours, staring at the sky or the earth beneath his feet. It was as though he were waiting for something to reveal itself to him. His mind was constantly at war with itself. Every day, the contradictions and uncertainties of his existence gnawed at him, pushing him deeper into solitude. He was consumed by the idea of transcendence, by the belief that there was a higher purpose for him that transcended the mundane life of those around him. He had once believed that asceticism would lead him to the divine, but now, as the days stretched on, he began to feel the cold sting of doubt creeping into his heart. There were whispers, though, quiet murmurs in the town square, when the townsfolk spoke of the monk, the strange man who never smiled, the man who never laughed, the man who prayed alone, in silence, and never seemed to enjoy the small joys of life. They didn't understand him, and they didn't want to. But there was something unsettling about Ibrahim, something that lingered in the air long after he had passed. Some spoke of him with pity, others with disdain, but all agreed on one thing: there was something wrong with the man. Still, Ibrahim continued his life of solitude. His days blended together, a monotonous rhythm of prayer and reflection. The isolation was beginning to take its toll. The quiet whispers that had once been harmless began to fester within him. He began to question the very beliefs that had brought him to this point. What was the true meaning of his existence? Was this life of isolation, this never-ending search for inner peace, truly the answer? As the days grew longer, he became more withdrawn, more obsessed with his search for truth. He spent hours, sometimes days, lost in his thoughts, his mind spinning with contradictions. And then, in the darkest corners of his mind, something shifted. A subtle but undeniable change. It was then that the visions began. At first they were fleeting, glimpses of something he couldn't quite grasp, half-formed images that dissolved as soon as he tried to focus on them. But with each passing day, the visions grew clearer. He saw himself standing before a great multitude, his hands raised high, calling for judgment. He saw the town of Arcadia burning, consumed by flames, and he felt no fear, only a sense of righteous purpose. The faces of the townsfolk, those who had dismissed him, those who had judged him, became contorted, their eyes wide with terror. They would not understand, he thought. They would not be saved. In his mind, he began to believe that his mission was not one of peace, but of destruction. And the town of Arcadia, with its peaceful ignorance, would be the first to face his judgment. The monk had begun his journey into madness, but no one in Arcadia knew yet. They still saw him as the quiet man, the solitary figure walking the streets, lost in thought. They had no idea that the man who had arrived so peacefully was now becoming something else entirely, something far more dangerous. It was early autumn when the first signs of change began to ripple beneath the surface of Ibrahim Al-Farouk's quiet existence. The once tranquil monk, whose presence had been as constant as the passing seasons, started to reveal cracks in his serene facade. The routine that had defined his life, prayer, meditation, solitude, began to warp into something darker, more obsessive. The calmness he had once exuded was replaced by a new tension, an unspoken restlessness that grew with each passing day. His walks through the fields became erratic, as if he were searching for something, though he never knew what it was. His gaze, which had once been downcast in humility, now shifted toward the horizon, filled with a strange hunger. Ibrahim's once steady routine of waking before dawn, meditating for hours, and then engaging in quiet prayer had become more erratic. He would sit for hours, staring at the ground, his fingers clenched in tight, restless knots, as if trying to grip onto something that he couldn't understand. His meditation no longer brought him peace. It only seemed to amplify the growing storm inside him. He began to skip meals, consumed by an intense, burning focus that pushed him further into isolation. The food, the sustenance of life, no longer seemed important. What he craved was something else, something intangible. His body became gaunt, his face hollow. His robes, once meticulously neat, became disheveled, the fabric torn and worn. The once pristine monk had begun to wither under the weight of his own dark thoughts. During his walks in the early morning hours, Ibrahim began to notice changes in his surroundings too. The town, so familiar and comforting in its simplicity, seemed somehow different now. It felt foreign. The trees that had once seemed so peaceful now loomed like silent watchers, their branches twisting toward him like skeletal fingers. The wind that had once carried a soft whisper through the fields now howled through the air, as though it carried voices just out of reach. There was something suffocating about the stillness that gripped the town. It had always been quiet, but now the silence felt oppressive, as if the world was holding its breath. And with each passing day, Ibrahim felt more disconnected from it all. The warmth of the town, the friendliness of its people, now felt like a false front, a mask hiding something ugly beneath. The first real break in his demeanor came when he attended the town's Friday prayers, which he had done regularly since his arrival. The mosque was small, nestled among the modest houses, and the imam, an elderly man named Hassan, had always greeted Ibrahim with kindness, offering him a seat at the front of the congregation. But this time something was different. Ibrahim entered the mosque late, his footsteps unnaturally loud against the cool, polished floors. His eyes scanned the faces of the congregation, lingering on each person with an intensity that unsettled those nearby. The imam, who had once welcomed Ibrahim with warmth, now noticed the change in him, a hardness in his gaze that seemed to pierce through the walls of the mosque itself. As the prayer began, Ibrahim's posture shifted. His back, once perfectly straight in humble submission, now hunched, as though carrying a heavy burden. His hands, which had once held the prayer beads with reverence, clenched tightly, his knuckles turning white with tension. The rhythm of the prayer seemed to elude him, as though he was no longer in sync with the words. His voice, which had once joined in harmony with the others, now faltered, rising in pitch, an unsettling edge creeping into it. The other worshippers noticed, glancing nervously at each other, unsure of what to make of it. But it was the moment of the final prostration that marked the first clear break. Instead of bowing with the others, Ibrahim remained standing, his eyes fixed on the imam with an unnerving intensity. His lips moved silently, as if speaking to someone unseen, his face twisted into a grimace of discomfort. The silence in the mosque became suffocating. For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped, as if the world had held its breath, along with Ibrahim. His body trembled slightly, as though struggling to contain something within him, something desperate and violent. Finally, he collapsed to his knees, but his prayer was no longer that of a humble monk. It was frantic, desperate, as though pleading for answers from a God who had long since abandoned him. The imam, seeing the distress in his face, stepped forward, but before he could reach him, Ibrahim stood abruptly and fled the mosque, leaving the congregation in stunned silence. Qiyam left the first house looking for him, and that night, Ibrahim returned to the monastery with a new urgency. The visions he had been having during his meditations had become more vivid, more real. He had seen the town burning, flames licking the edges of the horizon, the smoke rising like a tower of sin. He had seen the people, their faces twisted in fear, running through the streets, their cries for mercy lost in the inferno. The men in black, their special power, they had greeted us with love. And he had seen himself standing in the center of it all, his arms raised in a gesture of judgment, a godlike figure casting the world into chaos. The thought consumed him, poisoning his every waking moment. He had not chosen this path. It had been chosen for him. His role was clear. He was the one who would deliver the reckoning, the one who would cleanse the land of its impurities. He had felt the stirrings of it before, but now the call was undeniable. The monastery grounds became his sanctuary and his prison. Ibrahim spent hours pacing the courtyard, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he were trying to find his footing in a world that had grown alien to him. The trees around him seemed to whisper, the wind carrying words he couldn't understand. It wasn't enough to simply meditate or pray anymore. He needed more. The quiet days of reflection, the search for peace, had slipped away, replaced by an overwhelming compulsion. He began to plan, though he wasn't fully aware of it at first. His thoughts became tangled with purpose, his mind fixated on the idea of purification, on a greater calling that could not be ignored. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. The town was corrupt, and it was his duty to cleanse it, to save it from itself. He stopped attending the mosque altogether, distancing himself from the people who had once welcomed him. The townspeople, who had been suspicious of his arrival but had grown accustomed to his presence, began to notice his increasing absence, his strange behavior. They whispered in hushed tones, questioning the changes they saw in him, but no one dared to approach him. Ibrahim had become a shadow, always present, but never quite there. His once calm and gentle presence had turned cold, distant, and threatening. The quiet monk, who had once walked the streets with a soft gaze and a humble smile, now moved with a purpose that unsettled those around him. The air seemed to hum with tension, and the very earth beneath his feet felt like it was trembling in anticipation of what was to come. As the weeks wore on, the signs became more apparent. Ibrahim no longer seemed to hear the world around him. He no longer seemed to care for food or rest. He began to stockpile supplies in his small room at the monastery, water, canned food, and other provisions, as though preparing for something that was approaching, something inevitable. The dark thoughts that had once lurked at the edges of his mind now consumed him entirely. The town of Arcadia had failed him, and it would pay the price. The realization settled into him like a cold stone. The world had to be purged, and he would be the one to do it. Ibrahim's transformation was no longer a subtle shift. It was a full, terrifying break from the man he had once been, and the small town of Arcadia, which had been so untouched by the storms of the world, was about to learn the true cost of its ignorance. The quiet monk had awakened a rage that could no longer be contained, and with each passing day, that rage grew, swelling like a storm on the horizon. The first signs of change were only the beginning. The days grew shorter, the air crisper, as the harvest season drew near, but Ibrahim's world seemed to stretch endlessly inwards. The fall winds carried with them an eerie stillness that hung heavy around the monastery, a quiet tension in the air that only Ibrahim seemed to feel. His movements, once fluid and deliberate, now carried a sharpness, a precision that bordered on obsession. His mind, once calm and contemplative, was now a storm of thoughts, none of which allowed him to rest. There was something terrible taking shape in the folds of his consciousness, something he couldn't yet fully grasp, but something that burned with an undeniable certainty. He had come to believe that his presence in Arcadia was not by chance, but by divine design. The townspeople were blind, too ignorant to see the truth. They were all living in sin, in ignorance, and they needed to be shown the way. He would be the one to bring the reckoning. It began with small, almost imperceptible actions. Ibrahim spent hours in the monastery's chapel, kneeling before the cracked altar, his fingers pressing into the cold stone as though trying to draw power from the earth beneath. His silent prayers, once soft and melodic, were now forceful, as though he were pleading with something that had long ago turned its back on him. His palms grew raw from the constant contact with the altar, his fingers blistering from their touch. But this pain, this sacrifice, was necessary. He believed it was the price he had to pay to bring about the purity he sought. During the long solitary nights, Ibrahim would wander the monastery grounds, his steps careful and deliberate, as if he were mapping out the world itself. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, watching the world as it slept, unaware of the darkness he was cultivating in its midst. He no longer walked the fields in search of solace. Instead, he began to pace the grounds with purpose, stopping only to stare at the trees that towered over the property. The sound of the wind through their branches was now a whisper of judgment in his ears. He saw the monastery, the town, the very earth around him as a corrupt and decaying entity, and he was the purifier. He had to burn it all down, to cleanse it with fire. The idea consumed him, filling his waking hours and clouding his dreams. It was the only way, he believed, to bring true salvation, to rid the world of the rot that had taken root. Ibrahim's isolation deepened. The once quiet monk was no longer a figure of peaceful introspection. The townspeople, who had grown used to his reclusiveness, now felt a palpable unease when they crossed paths with him. His gaze, once soft and kind, had become cold, unblinking. His eyes no longer seemed to acknowledge the human world. They were focused on something beyond, something they could not see. And the few who still attempted to engage with him found him distant, unreachable. He no longer gave greetings or small courtesies. He moved like a shadow through the streets, an unsettling presence, a figure on the edge of everyone's perception. The warmth that had once radiated from him now felt like something foreign, as if the light that had once guided him had been extinguished by something darker. It wasn't long before he began his preparations. Ibrahim's thoughts had shifted from quiet contemplation to cold, methodical planning. The monastery's deteriorating state had made it easy for him to slip unnoticed into the shadows. There were weapons, of course, tools for survival and protection, but they were never enough. Ibrahim needed something more. He had seen the way the town had lived in comfort, in oblivion. He had seen their faces, their laughter, their ignorance. He knew that it was all a facade, that they lived in sin and indulgence while the world around them rotted. And now he was going to expose them. He was going to show them the price of their ignorance. Ibrahim spent hours alone in his room, drawing patterns and sketches. His mind churned with the precision of a tactician, the heart of a zealot. He traced out the town in the margins of old books, mapping the streets, the houses, the places where people gathered. He took note of the church, the mosque, the community center. Each building, each structure, was marked with the same grim symbol, a circle crossed by two lines, the mark of judgment. His fingers would trace the lines over and over, as though committing the layout of the town to memory. He had to know the geography of the destruction he would bring. He had to be prepared, to ensure that no one would escape. As the weeks passed, Ibrahim began to gather supplies. He would venture into town under the cover of darkness, slipping past the dimly lit streets, moving like a phantom among the sleeping residents. He avoided the main roads, taking alleyways and back paths, and entered the hardware store only when he knew the owner wouldn't be there. With each trip, his purchases grew more erratic. First, it was rope, then gasoline. He acquired knives, sharpened tools, and other implements of destruction. Each item was chosen carefully, with intention. He was meticulous, deliberate in his selections, as if each tool had a specific purpose in the chaos he was preparing to unleash. The more he gathered, the more his sense of certainty solidified. There was no turning back now. Ibrahim had begun to see himself as something greater than just a monk. He was the agent of fate, the one chosen to bring about the reckoning. He was beyond redemption, beyond the world of the townspeople. His mission was clear. The cleansing of Arcadia was inevitable. The town had to be purified by fire and blood. There was no other way. They had been given time to repent, to change, but they had ignored the signs. They had failed to see the truth, and now the punishment would come. As his plans took shape, Ibrahim began to see his surroundings differently. The very walls of the monastery seemed to echo with whispers, an endless cacophony of voices urging him onward. The silence he had once found so comforting now felt oppressive, as though the universe itself was pressing down on him, urging him to complete his task. He no longer found solace in prayer or meditation. These practices, once the core of his spiritual journey, now seemed like distractions, trivialities. His focus had shifted from the divine to the earthly, from the promise of salvation to the cold certainty of judgment. The more Ibrahim planned, the more the town around him seemed to blur. His vision of Arcadia became twisted, distorted in his mind. The familiar streets, the smiling faces of the townspeople, none of it seemed real anymore. The town had become a prison, a place filled with corruption and sin, a place that needed to be burned to the ground. He began to envision the destruction with clarity, He could see it unfolding in his mind's eye. The flames would spread quickly, consuming everything in their path. The cries of the people would echo through the streets, their desperate pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. The purity he sought would only be achieved through destruction. Only after the fire had claimed everything would the land be cleansed, and only then would the true meaning of his life be revealed. In the final days before he would execute his plan, Ibrahim felt a strange calm wash over him. He had made peace with what was to come. The weight of his actions, the devastation he would bring upon the town, no longer weighed on him. It was as if he had transcended the need for remorse, as if he had accepted the cost of his mission. The people of Arcadia would never understand his purpose, but they didn't need to. They would know soon enough, and Ibrahim Al-Farouk, once a humble monk seeking enlightenment, would become something else entirely, a force of judgment that would forever alter the course of the town's history. The planning was complete, the pieces were in place, and as the sun set one final time over the sleepy town of Arcadia, Ibrahim prepared to set his plan into motion. The world would never be the same again. The night had fallen, thick with a suffocating silence that hung like a heavy fog over Arcadia. The town, usually a peaceful place where every street lamp flickered lazily to life at dusk, now seemed poised on the edge of something terrible. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as though nature itself was waiting for the first sign of what was to come. The moon, barely a sliver in the sky, cast a pale light over the quiet houses, the empty streets, and the rows of trees that swayed restlessly. Ibrahim stood at the edge of the monastery, his silhouette a dark figure against the faint glow of the horizon. His robes were no longer pristine, but stained, torn by the weight of his plans. His face, gaunt and hollow, looked as though it had not seen sleep in weeks, the dark circles beneath his eyes only deepening the intensity of his stare. He had been preparing for this moment for months, collecting his supplies, perfecting the plan, and now the time had come. The town of Arcadia had no idea what was about to befall them. With a final steadying breath, Ibrahim turned away from the monastery and began to walk toward the town. His pace was slow, deliberate, as though each step carried with it the weight of fate itself. His hand rested on the cold metal of a large duffel bag slung over his shoulder, its contents heavy with the promise of destruction. He could feel the rough texture of the rope inside, the cold, smooth edges of the knives, the sharp scent of gasoline still lingering on the fabric. Each item, each tool, was a small piece of the hell he was about to unleash. The town was quiet, as it always was at this hour, but tonight there was a tension in the air, an almost oppressive stillness. The houses were dark, their windows closed against the chill of the night. The streets were empty, save for the occasional stray cat darting between the alleyways or the sound of a car engine rumbling in the distance. It was the kind of quiet that preceded disaster, the calm before the storm. Ibrahim's heart beat with a strange rhythm, not with fear or anxiety, but with anticipation. This was what he had been waiting for, what he had been called to do. The time for hesitation had passed. The first house he approached was a small one on the edge of the town. It belonged to an elderly couple who had lived in Arcadia for decades. Ibrahim had seen them many times, their familiar faces often greeting him in the market, their wrinkled smiles never once faltering. But tonight, their faces would not be enough to protect them. As he stepped onto the porch, his hands trembled slightly. Not from doubt, but from something else, something darker. He was aware, suddenly, of the enormity of what he was about to do. But that awareness only deepened his resolve. There was no turning back. He pulled the rope from his bag and with a swift motion tied it securely around the front door handle. He could hear the soft creaking of the old wood, the rattle of the hinges in the quiet night. A few careful tugs confirmed the knot was tight. The gasoline, poured generously onto the porch, left a pungent trail as it seeped into the cracks of the wooden floorboards. The scent burned his nostrils, but Ibrahim did not flinch. His focus was unwavering, his mind already turning to the next step. Inside, the couple slept, unaware, their peaceful breaths rising and falling in the dark. Ibrahim did not hesitate. He reached into his bag and retrieved the small, razor-sharp knife he had taken from the monastery. Its cold blade gleamed under the dim moonlight. He moved swiftly, silently, through the cracks in the door. It was easy. The door gave way with a simple nudge, the thin wood splintering under his touch. He crept inside, his every movement purposeful, calculated. The elderly man was the first to wake, his hand clutching at his chest as a strange, almost instinctual fear surged through him. But before he could call out, Ibrahim was there, pressing the blade against his throat. The man gasped in shock, his eyes wide with confusion, but the pressure of the blade silenced any cries for help. Ibrahim's hand tightened, a quiet exhale escaping his lips. The blood was already beginning to seep from the man's throat, painting the floor a deep, dark red. The woman awoke to the sounds of her husband's struggle, her eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing she could do. Ibrahim moved toward her, his movements swift, efficient. She tried to scream, but the rag he shoved into her mouth muffled the sound. She kicked and struggled against him, but her frail body was no match for the fury in his eyes. Her last breath was a shallow gasp, the fear in her eyes fading into nothingness as she slumped to the floor. Ibrahim stood for a moment, gazing down at the two bodies, their blood pooling around them like a dark, spreading stain. The task was not complete, but it was a necessary beginning. The reckoning had begun. He left the house quietly, moving swiftly through the shadows, his senses heightened as though every corner of the town held a new target. Each step was now a part of the larger ritual, one house, one life, at a time. The next target was a small apartment complex on the other side of town, its tenants completely unaware of the hell that was about to descend upon them. The apartment was eerily quiet as well. Ibrahim moved from door to door, his eyes scanning each number on the faded plaques. Each one was an entry into the next part of the nightmare. His heart raced, but his mind was calm, cold. He worked with an almost clinical precision, methodically ensuring that no one would escape his wrath. He placed the gasoline carefully by each door, pouring it slowly and deliberately, as though each drop was sealing the fate of the people inside. Once the gasoline soaked the wood floors, he moved to the final phase of his plan. He pulled from his bag a handful of matches, the small wooden stick striking against the matchbox with a satisfying rasp. He lit the first one, watching the flame dance in his fingertips. The match burned bright for a moment, then flickered out, leaving a trail of ash. Ibrahim moved to the first door and tossed the match onto the gasoline-soaked floor, watching the fire catch and spread with terrifying speed. The flames licked the walls, hungrily devouring the wood as it crackled and snapped, the fire's hunger seeming to mirror his own. He moved quickly, lighting the second match, then the third, each one setting fire to another part of the town, ensuring that no corner would remain untouched. The first screams echoed through the night, distant at first, like a vague, haunting wail carried by the wind. But soon, the sounds grew louder, sharper, desperate, frantic cries that filled the air, mingling with the crackling of the flames. Ibrahim did not flinch. He did not pause. He kept moving through the town like a shadow, a silent executioner. His actions were as inevitable as the coming dawn. The fire was now a force of nature, consuming everything in its path, just as he had planned. As the town burned, Ibrahim felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. This was the beginning of the purification he had envisioned. The screams that filled the air were only temporary, fleeting. Soon the town would be reduced to ash, and from that ash, something new would rise. He would be the one to witness it, the one who would cleanse the world of its corruption. And when it was all over, when the last embers had faded into the night, he would be there to rebuild, to lead, to purify. The massacre had begun, and nothing could stop it now. The town of Arcadia, once a quiet, peaceful place, was now engulfed in chaos. Flames had consumed homes, businesses, and lives, leaving nothing but scorched earth and the desperate cries of those fighting for survival. But even as the fire raged, the true horror was not in the inferno itself. It was in the man responsible for it. Ibrahim was still out there, somewhere, blending into the shadows, his presence like a ghost haunting the smoke-filled streets. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, the authorities scrambled to establish some kind of order, though their efforts were futile against the tidal wave of death and destruction. The county sheriff, a grizzled man named Mark Jackson, was the first to organize a search. He was no stranger to death in his line of work, but the brutality of the night's events shattered even his hardened exterior. The fire had claimed more lives than he could count, but it was the methodical nature of the killings that sent chills down his spine. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a carefully orchestrated purge. The sheriff gathered a small team of officers and volunteers, each one armed with only a flashlight and a rifle, heading into the night with nothing but the remnants of the town to guide them. They combed the streets, moving from house to house, from alley to alley, their eyes flicking nervously over every shadow, every corner where something might be lurking. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, as though the darkness itself was alive, hiding the truth from them. As they moved further into the heart of Arcadia, the town began to feel less like a community and more like a war zone. The smoke choked the air, and the acrid scent of burning flesh hung in the wind. Shattered glass littered the streets, the remnants of lives once full of promise, now reduced to debris. The silence between the searchers was broken only by the occasional scream in the distance, a reminder that Ibrahim was still out there, still watching, still hunting. The sheriff knew that Ibrahim wouldn't be caught easily. The monk had been methodical in his destruction, and the way he had vanished into the night showed a calculated patience. Ibrahim had prepared for this. He had prepared for the chase. His mind, once serene and thoughtful, had become a labyrinth of strategy and purpose. He had known that the town would eventually fight back, but he had planned for that too. The search dragged on for hours, each minute stretching longer than the last. They moved cautiously, as though afraid to draw too much attention, but there was no sign of Ibrahim. It was as if he had disappeared into the very earth itself. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, no trace of the man who had unleashed hell on Arcadia. The only thing left behind was destruction. Sheriff Jackson's mind raced as the night deepened. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ibrahim was close, that he was watching them. Somewhere in the darkness, the monk was waiting, his calm eyes tracking their every move. He knew the town, knew its every alley, its every hiding place. Ibrahim had been part of this community, had walked its streets with an unsettling tranquility. And now, he was a shadow, slipping through cracks, always just out of reach. The sheriff's team reached the outskirts of town, where the trees began to crowd the narrow roads, and the remnants of Arcadia fell behind them. The air grew colder, the shadows longer. It was here, in the darkness of the woods, that they felt the full weight of their vulnerability. The deeper they ventured into the wilderness, the more they realized they were no longer searching for a man. They were hunting a predator. The hunt had begun, but with every passing moment it became clearer that it was no longer a matter of finding Ibrahim, it was a matter of survival. The town was gone, and whatever came next would be a twisted game of cat and mouse, where the only certainty was that Ibrahim would never be the one caught. He had become something else, something no longer bound by the rules of the living. He had become an embodiment of fear, an unseen force moving in the night, and Arcadia was his hunting ground. The sun had barely begun to rise when Sheriff Jackson and his remaining team found themselves standing at the edge of what was once Arcadia's heart. The fire had subsided, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins and an almost unbearable silence. The air still smelled of ash and charred remnants, the town's bones now exposed to the world. But it wasn't just the smoke that lingered in the atmosphere. There was something more palpable, something thick and suffocating, the presence of something malevolent. Ibrahim was still out there, and now, with the full extent of his destruction laid bare, there was nothing left to stop him. Jackson and the few deputies left knew they had to act fast. Arcadia's few survivors had been evacuated, and the rest of the town was a graveyard of scorched homes, broken glass, and twisted metal. Yet, the true horror wasn't in the destruction, it was the people. They were gone, yes, but not all of them were dead. The bodies they had found were marked by strange ritualistic patterns, brutally slashed throats, eyes wide in terror, hands clutching at the earth, as if reaching for something beyond the grave. It was the handiwork of someone who had given themselves entirely to something darker, someone who had surrendered to a monstrous impulse. And then there was Ibrahim's message, left on the monastery's altar, a series of cryptic symbols drawn in blood, his final declaration. His cleansing was not over. It had only just begun. The hunt had brought them to the outskirts of Arcadia, to a broken-down farmhouse hidden in the underbrush, far from the prying eyes of civilization. It was here, in the quiet desolation of the abandoned landscape, that Sheriff Jackson and his team finally found what they had been dreading. Ibrahim was waiting, but it wasn't just him. His mind, sharp and unwavering, had led him to this final stand, a place where he could finish his twisted purpose and force the world to witness his vision. There were no words, no cries of defiance or repentance, just the cold, dead stare of the man who had once taken vows of peace, now an executioner of his own design. Ibrahim stood at the center of the farmhouse, surrounded by more bodies, bodies of those who had tried to stop him, who had tried to force him to face the reality of what he had become. He had slaughtered them all without hesitation, his rage turning the house into a tomb. Their eyes, lifeless and glazed, mirrored the same fear he had instilled in the hearts of so many. As the sheriff approached, a final, chilling realization set in. Ibrahim had set the house on fire, another part of his ritual. The flames already crept toward them, licking at the walls with an insatiable hunger. But they couldn't leave. Not yet. They had to stop him. The battle was quick, brutal, and final. In the end, Ibrahim fell, his body slumped against the farmhouse floor, his dark eyes staring up at the ceiling as the flames consumed everything around him. There was no victory in his defeat, only a sense of hollow inevitability, as though the man who had once been part of the world had truly never been there at all. In the days that followed, the town of Arcadia was buried, both in the ashes of its former self and in the haunting memories of what had transpired. The massacre, the destruction, the madness, these were not easily forgotten. Even though Ibrahim's reign of terror had ended, its ripple effect stretched far beyond the burned walls of the town. Survivors, those few who managed to escape, were left to grapple with their trauma. The horrors they had witnessed would never leave them, never fade. And for those who had seen the brutal aftermath, who had lived through the flames and the bloodshed, there was only one certainty: Arcadia was gone, and in its place, there was only darkness.